Hi everyone. Thanks for inviting me to your meetup. I'm sorry I can't be there, but I hope you enjoy this video. I'm excited to talk about accessibility with you, so if you have any questions, feel free to contact me on LinkedIn. Why did I come up with this topic? I was seeing a bunch of posts on LinkedIn that said inclusiveness, but very often they weren't talking about accessibility or people with disabilities. So what I'll be talking about today are how accessibility is a UX task, the models of disability, types of disability, guidelines for improving accessibility, the definition of universal, accessible, and inclusive design, and examples of how designs include people. A little bit about me. I'm a UX designer and researcher and a former front-end developer. I made my first website 20 plus years ago. I have 8 years of experience with web accessibility, and that includes training business partners, UX designers, developers, and quality assurance. I'm a member of the International Association of Accessibility Professional Web Development Committee. I am working on an Assistive Technology and Accessible Design graduate certificate at UW-Milwaukee, and I have a master's degree in human-computer interaction from DePaul University. Let's take a look at some terms that we'll be using throughout this presentation. PWD stands for people with disabilities. Typical user, someone not known to have a disability. The word typical is preferred over the word average, just because average doesn't really exist. WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Those are the international standards for creating accessible websites. ADAG, American with Disabilities Act Accessibility Guidelines. Those are the U.S. standards on how to build buildings and transportation or public accommodations. And AT, Assistive Technology. These are tools used by people with disabilities, like a screen reader, a wheelchair, or a hearing aid. Why do I think accessibility is a UX task? Well, as designers, we want to understand the people who use our designs, why they use the designs, how they do their task with our designs, and what frustrations do they encounter when using our designs. And when we're designing, we're often thinking about the typical user. But if we look at this quote from the CDC, 26% of adults in the United States have some type of disability, meaning that our designs might not be that useful, usable, efficient, or effective for all of our users. So the one thing I really want us to think about during this presentation are a few questions. So when we're looking at this different products, let's think to ourselves, as a person who is blind, how can I use a TV remote? As a person who uses a wheelchair, how can I get into a building easier? As a person who is deaf, how can I watch and understand what is being said on a YouTube video? And as designers, when we're looking at these products or services, we need to think about how does this design include or exclude that person, and how can the design be made better? Here we have some statistics from the Pew Research Center showing us that people with disabilities are adopting technology at lower rates, and that is with computers, smartphones, home broadband, and tablets. There could be many reasons for this. Some is the cost of the extra technology. A lot of people with disabilities also need to purchase other types of assistive technology, so discretionary income might be a little bit low. Another reason might be because of the design of the products, making it more difficult for them to use. To better understand some of the issues people might have with websites, let's take a look at this graphic from the WebAIM website itself. They teach people how to make accessible websites, and they also do surveys of websites to see how accessible they are. And they do surveys to see how people with disabilities are able to use different websites. And as we can see here from this WebAIM chart, they say that 98.1% of website home pages have failures in the WCAG standards. So they're saying that most of the websites out there are not accessible. And as we know, if we find something is difficult to use, we're very likely not to use it again and try to find something else that we can use. So that's very telling in saying that a lot of people are missing out on particular audiences because their website is not accessible. So taking a look at their chart, they show 6 different areas that they looked at. We'll just go over a couple of these. They say that over 75% of websites' home pages have low color contrast, and that means that somebody that's colorblind or has vision disabilities might have difficulty using that website. Missing alternative text. So there are images that we might put text in the image. A lot of people, especially if you're blind or have vision impairments, would be using something that's called a screen reader, and that reads the text on the page to the person. But if we put the text in an image, the screen reader can't read that. So there's a way to use alternative text that can be read by a screen reader. And it says here that over 50% of home pages are missing alternative text. In the physical world, like public accommodations, buildings, services, or transportation, I found this statistic that said 20% of people with disabilities experience barriers once a day, and 12% experience barriers multiple times a day. But I found this number really low. On the right, I have a screenshot of a YouTube video by Zach Anner. He has cerebral palsy. He's in New York City, leaving his hotel room, trying to go get a bagel. Google Maps said it would take 28 minutes, but for him it took 5 hours. I think it's really important for us to remember as designers that how we design can cause people to spend more time and more effort to do what typical people might think just a mundane task. So I provided the YouTube video link here, and you'll be able to watch that on your own. Just want to say there is some cussing in it, so if you're sensitive to that, just be forewarned. For housing, 15% of the U.S. households need accessible homes, but only 6% of the homes in the United States are accessible, and only 9% of those who need accessible homes are living in them. There are no specific laws for single-family homes related to accessibility. Newer homes are adapting ADAG anyway. That's part because as the number of elderly is expanding, those people want to age in place or stay in the home that they currently have. And as they age, they're also growing into one or more disabilities. So the housing either needs to adapt to them, already have the accessible facilities in place so that as we age, we're not expected to move into independent living or other types of housing, but we can stay in the comfort of our own home. What does good design mean to a person with a disability? Well, it means improved quality of life. They are more dependent, more informed, and more engaged with their community. They no longer require waiting for somebody to help them with a task. And I really like this graphic here. On the top left, we have 4 dots. One of them is separate from the others. And underneath it, it says, I'm apart, meaning I'm separated. On the top right, the 4 dots are together, and the text underneath says, I'm a part, meaning we're together, or in other words, inclusion. The models of disability is how our society thinks about disabilities, or our attitudes towards disabilities. In the medical model, it is often thought we need to find a cure for the disability, disease, or illness, and the individual comes second. In the charity model, it's more fatalistic. People with disabilities should be dependent on social programs and donations and need to be taken care of. In the economic model, it's related to charity, where a person with a disability has reduced access to employment and income, and because of that, they may also need social programs and donations. The empowering model gives the individual and the family the ability to make choices about their treatment, and they're able to make goals about being independent. The social model puts the individual first, and it says that the environment is what is causing barriers and not the disability. So let's take a look at it in other terms. On the left, we have the traditional models, which are medical, charity, and economic. And there are other ones, so you can Google those and find out. There's a link on the previous slide. And in that case, it's saying that the person or the disability is the problem, not the environment. So the disability needs to be fixed or taken care of. In the social model, we see that the barrier is actually the environment, and it considers that the person is just fine. It's just the environment is not designed for their needs. And we can take a look at it another way. Here we have an illustration of a person in a wheelchair at the bottom of a set of stairs. There's a sign that says, "Weigh in, everybody welcome." On the left is a thought bubble using the medical model. And it says her impairment is the problem. They should cure her or give her prosthetics. And on the right is a thought bubble for the social model. And it says the stairs are the problem. They should build a ramp. I really like this image from Microsoft that explains different types of disabilities. It has 4 rows for different senses: touch, see, hear, and speak. And it has 3 columns that are kind of like the longevity of a disability: permanent, temporary, and situational. And then in the chart, it has different types of disabilities for each one of those. So we can look at touch and temporary, and we see there's an arm injury. That could be a broken arm, and eventually that will heal. With hear and bartender, that's a situational disability. He's in a loud location, like a bar, and when he leaves the bar, his hearing will go back to what it normally is like for him. And then we also have see and permanent, and we see that there's a person that is blind in that spot. And that's a permanent disability because that's something that very likely that person will live with for most of their life. One thing that's not really clear here about permanent disabilities is that some people assume it's from when you're born and you just have it your whole life, but oftentimes the disability happens, or a permanent disability will happen at some other point in our life, and then we'll just continue having it. But also, this graph doesn't show other types of disabilities, like behavioral, which is autism, anxiety, depression, or brain trauma; cognitive, like Down syndrome, poor memory, and problem solving and learning disabilities; and mobility, like arthritis, cerebral palsy, and upper and lower extremity. As designers, we often have to think about how people use our designs or the products we create. And the first step in that is, does the person perceive or sense it? Or do they understand that something exists? And we do that with our senses. So do we smell it, see it, taste it, touch it, or hear it? Once we understand something exists, we need to understand what it's telling us or what we can do with it. So right here I have my cell phone in my hand, and I can see it. I'm also touching it. And I can see that there are a lot of apps icons on one of the screens. That's because I put them there, so I understand what they are about. And while I'm doing that, I also need to make a decision of what I'm going to do with this. Am I going to open an app? Am I going to ignore this and put it away? Once I decide that I want to do something with it, I will interact with it. So I could tap one of the icons and have the app open. So I'm using my senses there again of being able to see which app I want to open and using my hand to tap on it to open it. And then we have to also think about how is somebody going to interact with it? What kind of device are they going to use? And in this case, it was my cell phone and my finger trying to make it work. And that kind of fits nicely with how WCAG, or the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, work. They section it out by perceiving, understanding, and interacting. And they use the acronym POUR. So it's a little bit in a different order, but that's okay. So first, when you go to a website and say you're trying to fill out a contact form, you need to sense or perceive that there are inputs that you can do something with. So you're looking at it, or if you're using a screen reader, it reads it to you. So you're sensing it. Their next step is operable, which we were calling interact in the previous slide. Am I able to interact with it? Can I type into that input to put in my first name? And understandable. Do I understand what I'm supposed to do with that input? If there's a label in front of it, I know that it wants my first name, and that's what I can type in. And robust. That's how the code needs to be able to be usable by different technologies, like assistive technology. So here we have a picture of somebody in a wheelchair. They have a laptop on their lap, and in their mouth they have a sip and puff straw. With that sip and puff straw, they are interacting with the website. They can navigate, they can put in their first name in that contact form. They still understand and perceive that something is happening, but that sip and puff straw is helping them to interact. This next screenshot is of a YouTube video of somebody using a screen reader. And a screen reader is helpful for somebody who is blind or has low vision or possibly is a cognitive disability. And what it does is a piece of software that when you open it will read what is on the text that is on your computer, like a website. And you can watch that video too. The link is right there in the bottom. And in this one, we see somebody using a Braille reader. So it can be used along with a screen reader. And instead of the screen reader reading to them, they'll feel what the text is through their fingers. And they can also, there's also Braille readers that the person can type into. So like that input field, they would be able to type in their name. The guidelines for physical environments are the ADAG guidelines. And this started with Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. It applies to the design and construction of public accommodations like medical facilities, lodging, education, transportation, federal assisted housing, and government facilities. Unlike the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which are divided out by how we might use something, like our senses, ADAG is organized by space type. So we have parking spaces. This image shows us that the van accessible sign needs to be at least 60 inches above the ground. And light switches and outlets also need to be a certain height above the ground so that a person that uses a wheelchair is able to use them. And for people who are blind, elevators need to have Braille next to the push buttons. And hopefully along with that, there's some sort of auditory signal that tells the person what floor they're on or if the door is open or closed. Let's take a look at the definitions of universal, accessible, and inclusive design. Very often they're used interchangeably, but they're not the same thing. As we take a look at these definitions, think of how you use these in your own projects. Starting with universal design, it's a set of 7 principles that we create one design that is usable by most people. It doesn't look at any specific abilities or disabilities and requires no special tools like assistive technology to be used. Next is accessible design. Very often these follow guidelines like WCAG and ADAG, and it may require assistive technology to remove the barriers. We'll look at different disability types to focus on the usability for those particular people, and we should always design and test with those users. The two images I have here, the one on the top is a person using a braille reader, and at the bottom there's a person who uses a wheelchair going up a wheelchair ramp. The braille reader and the wheelchair are the assistive technology. And in this case, on the bottom with the wheelchair, the design is the wheelchair ramp instead of a set of stairs. So that's a case where the design is enabling the user. In inclusive design, we go beyond accessibility. Inclusive design is more of a design philosophy that includes language, socioeconomics, abilities or disabilities, device type, like a phone or a laptop, the location that somebody is in, and the internet connection. Like, it could be really slow for some people, it could be really fast for some people. And there's other pieces that go along with inclusive design too. On the right, there is an image or a graphic of quite a diverse group of people. There's different ages, genders, people of different heights, people with different hair colors, people wearing different types of clothing. Some people are wearing glasses. There's a person using a wheelchair, and there's somebody with a dog. And in this case, we not only focus on usability, but also on the content messaging. So it's how you write your text or what images that you put on your website or on your marketing material. Because in inclusive design, there is no average user. Everyone's unique. And in this case, you also need to design and research with real users. Now let's think about how our designs or designs that we see in the real world can include people. I'm going to start with some examples from WCAG or for websites. These are set guidelines for us to learn about and understand and how we can improve websites to be more accessible for different types of people. The first example, like that WebAIM chart we saw earlier on, is about color contrast ratio. I once received an email that had an orange background with purple text, and it was hard enough for me to read. And when I put the colors into the WebAIM color contrast checker, we can see that the WCAG AA value here means that those two colors together failed. An appropriate color contrast would improve this design for users who are colorblind or have vision disabilities. So the designers of this could have used this color contrast checker to see how their colors would affect different types of users. The colors here could also affect people with temporary or situational disabilities. There could have been screen glare or poor lighting that would have made this color combination harder to read. Images on websites should also include alternative text so that somebody who is blind or has low vision or is using a screen reader is able to understand the context of that image along with the other content on the page. In this case, I have a picture of the UWM landscape or their campus picture. And underneath that, I have the code that I grabbed out of their website, and we see that there's the alt text right there that I circled in red. A screen reader will read UWM campus aerial photo so that the person who is using a screen reader can understand what that picture is about. The alt text is not seen on the screen, so it's only read by the screen reader. And doing this will improve the design for people who are blind or have cognitive disabilities when they are using the screen reader. For people who are deaf or have low hearing, or even people with cognitive disabilities, transcripts and closed captions are very useful. A transcript is a text file used with a video on the same or on a separate page. And closed caption is what we see in the image to the right. It is text overlaid on the video in sync with what is happening on the video. So somebody in the background is saying, "I'm Max Dalton," and now somebody has closed captions turned on is able to read the text also. This design is improved for people who are deaf, have low hearing, or have a cognitive disability. But for those with temporary situational disabilities, you might be in a loud bar or restaurant and not be able to hear the TV. So the closed captions allow you to read what is being said on the TV. Or in some places, the sound is turned down, so you're not able to hear it. Using a keyboard is another way for people to use assistive technology. The keyboard or another device other than a mouse can be used to interact with the web content. So say that you're on a website and you use your keyboard tab key. You initially start on the first link on the page and you use the tab key to go through the other links on the web page. When you're doing that, you also need some sort of visual indication to be able to see which particular link has the tab focus on it. Use our mouse to hover over a link and then click on it. But with the keyboard, you use a tab key to move to a particular link and then use the enter key as if you were clicking on that link so you can navigate to another page. The keyboard shortcuts like these, anyone can use, and some people find them quicker to use. We need to make sure that we're improving our designs for websites so that people who are blind, have visual disabilities, or have upper extremity disabilities are able to use our websites. So being able to use the keyboard is very important to them. Now, for people who are blind or have visual disabilities, they can also use this with their screen reader. Actually, a screen reader gives them more keyboard shortcuts than if you weren't using a screen reader. But it still is important for those of us who are sighted to be able to, when we're using the keyboard to navigate instead of our mouse, to be able to see where our tabbing focus is ending up on the page. So one thing I usually tell developers when they're learning how to do accessibility is put away your mouse and play around with the tab key, the space key, the enter key, and the arrow keys. Now, if we're looking at temporary or situational disabilities, it might be that your mouse no longer works, maybe the battery died, or maybe the mouse isn't being detected. For the physical world, we also need to think about things like food packaging. We see on the right a picture of a snack package with a peach background and light peach text. Now, there are regulations for the type of content on food packaging, like the nutritional information and the ingredient list. But there are no regulations for the color contrast or text size. So let's think back again about that question of, as a user who is colorblind, how is this product going to include or exclude me? Now, I would say because of the color contrast, it might exclude a few people. But then again, the small text is also going to exclude people because it could be hard to read for people with vision disabilities. It also affects people with temporary or situational disabilities because of poor lighting, cataracts, or maybe they just lost their glasses or don't have them handy. So as designers, let's think about how we can improve this design. Higher color contrast and larger text might just do the trick. Another example of the physical world is grocery store shelves. Here we have a picture of a woman standing at the bottom of a dairy case, reaching to the top shelf of the dairy case. And for many people, the items at the grocery store are out of reach. This design of the shelving can also affect people who use wheelchairs or who have mobility disabilities. It also affects people who are short and children. Often the people who can't reach the top shelf need to wait for somebody who's taller to ask for help. They leave the store without buying the item, or they use an online ordering system to pick up or have their groceries delivered. So let's think again about, as a person who uses a wheelchair, how does this shelving design include or exclude me? And then as a designer, let's think about how we can improve this design. I thought of one way where we place the items vertically on many shelves instead of horizontally on one. That way, the taller people can reach the items on the tall shelves, and people who can't reach up that high can take the items off the lower shelves. And then we have this example of a drive-up bank window. When I first saw this, it really kind of thought about how I can't really reach that button to attract the attention of the teller. But then I started realizing that I really never understand what the bank teller is saying through those speakers, and I'm not sure she understands what I'm saying. I usually just shake or nod my head and hope it was the right answer. But for people with hearing or speech disabilities, the speaker system is really a barrier in communication. For the typical user, it can just be that the speaker system is very poor or they're in a noisy traffic area, and that's what makes the speaker system not very effective. So let's think about it again as a person who is deaf. How does this design include or exclude me? And then as a designer, let's think about how we can improve this design. One way I thought about was a digital text device that gets passed through the tray and you can communicate privately with the teller. And then there's physical world examples out there that were designed for particular disabilities, but then became so popular and useful for everybody. Curb cuts are one of those. The first design was made for people who use wheelchairs, so we think back about what accessible design is. It was something that is built with a particular disability in mind. But that design caused a few problems with people who were blind. The original design didn't include the bumps in the curb cut, so people who were blind weren't really able to tell if the slope in the sidewalk was a driveway, a curb cut, just bad construction of a curb. They didn't know what it was for. The design went through some iteration, and they added those bumps in the curb cut. And now you can see in this middle picture a person using a white cane who is able to tell that is a curb cut because there are now bumps in the curb cut. But then we can look at the image on the far right, and there's a woman pushing a stroller across the crosswalk, and she had just come off a curb cut. And that's how important curb cuts have been. When you look at it, there's people who use bikes, people with skateboards, maybe they use a cane, maybe it's a person who can't lift their foot high enough to step up the curb on their own. So the curb cut has really become such an important feature in our landscape that we don't really think about them anymore, but they have become something that we just take for granted and so many people are able to use for different reasons. And another product like that is the OXO Good Grips, and the first one was the vegetable peeler. It was initially designed for a person with arthritis, and some of the design goals was that it had to be comfortable to use, but it also had to look good. And because of that, they became very successful for the typical user. And the product line grew to include other kitchen tools. When I was reading through some of OXO's case study on this, they definitely said they used universal design principles. And their quote here says, "When all users' needs are taken into consideration in the initial design process, the result is a product that can be used by the broadest spectrum of users." And some last notes. Always research and test with people with disabilities. What we saw in the slide deck today was a good foundation to learn more. There's links and links to videos to watch so that you can learn more. Use this as a good jumping off point. We learned about different modes of disabilities, types of disabilities. We saw that there are a few videos out there to see how people use assistive technology, and a video of how somebody went from a hotel room to a bagel shop and saw how much more effort and time it took them to do that than it might take the typical person. Based off what we learned today, we still need to know that our knowledge is still assumptions. And that's what we do in UX all the time. We may know something for ourselves, but until we actually talk with a real user of the product, we still have assumptions. And people with disabilities are not fringe use cases. They are our actual users. Remember that 26% of the population, or of the adult population in the United States, has some sort of disability. That's a pretty large percentage. They are not fringe cases. They are our everyday users. And the more that we design to include them, the more likely they will be our users and our loyal users. And you may have noticed that I was using person-first language. So you always say the person and then the disability. So it's Brian, who is blind, a user who is on the autism spectrum, a person who uses a wheelchair. But some people prefer other terminology, and when you get a chance, ask the individual for their preference. Think about the process that you want to design with. Is it universal design, accessible design, inclusive design? And also, in your mind, when you are creating designs or trying to come up with a product or a service that is going to be accessible, always ask yourself, as a person who uses a wheelchair, how does this design include or exclude them? And how can I make the design better? And I want to thank you for listening to the video. Sorry I couldn't be there in person, or whichever system that was going to be, video conferencing system. And of course, I am going to make sure that you can get the slide deck so you can get those links and connect with me on LinkedIn. Thank you very much.